Okay, well, welcome to our Social Justice Leaders online event. I'm delighted to have with me this evening two of our 2021 inductees. Individually, these women are powerhouses of energy and activism in the face of widespread social injustices. Together, they are catalysts for change and harbingers of hope in the battle for human rights and dignity. Please welcome Teresa Younger, CEO and President of the Ms. Foundation, and Kica Matos, Vice President of Initiatives at the Vera Institute of Justice. Bravo! Thank you both for being here. I also wish to pay homage tonight to Jory Marie Lisa Gang, considered by many to be the grandmother of the transgender movement in our state, who was posthumously inducted this year. Her spirit remains vibrant and voice powerful, channeled by the thousands of activists she inspired in the continued battle for social justice. This will be a half-hour intimate and informative chat, followed by 15 minutes of your questions, which we encourage you to submit at any time by simply clicking the Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen. I'll try to get to as many as possible. Before we begin, I ask you all to be as close to your modem as possible, to turn up your computer volume, brighten your screen, and let's take a look back on September 29th this year, when the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame held its first ever outdoor induction ceremony alongside the majestic Connecticut River, where the famed Amistad ship stood as a symbol to the courageous effort of the women leaders in social justice honored that evening. And now, our tech guru, Michelle, will reveal those highlights. Thank you all for being here. Throughout America's rich history of activism, women have taken to the streets. Presently, there are 9 giant social justice issues facing America: healthcare, voter rights, racial injustice, the refugee crisis, gun violence, the income gap, hunger, climate justice, and equality. The Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame is proud to honor and recognize the women at the forefront of these issues. But tonight, we ask that each one of you pledge allegiance to action.
Read more about our Spotlight recipients in the virtual program book. Thank you, and have an enjoyable evening.
The truth is that justice almost always comes through fierce and sometimes lengthy battles. Battles fought by women, men, and young people, many of whom are directly impacted by injustice. They are amongst those who march, who protest, who make their voices heard, and who often put their bodies on the line.
Jerry Marie was living out intersectionality long before that word became popularized. She made me and so many of us better allies and better activists.
Social justice is about changing the totally screwed up systems that have been put in place. Let us not forget that not one system was designed for us or by us. And because of that, we cannot accept it. Every day, we have to do just one thing.
So I ask you, get to the streets, stand up, join the rebellion, and do not quit until social justice is ours.
This year will be 100 years of women gaining the right to vote, which was a huge accomplishment. But there's a lot of unconscious bias that exists today still. The question we really want to answer is what we can do to create an equal environment and equal opportunities for women looking to accelerate and advance their careers as men have done. At Stanley Black & Decker, we've signed on to gender parity by the year 2030. We're putting together a lot of programs and initiatives to create an environment that women need to really be successful. We support Green Light for Girls and STEAM education programs in the communities where our employees live and work. We're working with incredible women outside of the company as well and breaking down barriers around the world. Gender equality is where my daughter can grow up and not even think about gender equality being an issue.
Well, there we go. That was a fabulous evening, don't you think?
It was amazing. It was great.
As you saw in that clip, I outlined 9 gigantic issues. I don't need to repeat them, but there's no denying that these issues coexist here and all over the globe. My first question to both of you is, what issues you focus on and why? Teresa?
So at the Ms. Foundation for Women, we work on the movements that affect the lives of women and their communities. So all of those issues that you lifted up are the issues that our partners in the field are working on. You know, criminal justice reform, this very real issue about environmental justice. At the same time, they are working on voter rights and access to women's effective women's, comprehensive women's health care. We are working on an allotment of those issues, as well as working towards not just parity, but equity in the work that we are trying to do. And it is an honor to see not just the hall lifting up these issues, but to be sitting at a table at an opportunity in this moment of time with my fellow inductees. I actually got a chance to work with Jerry Marie when I was working on marriage equality in the state of Connecticut, and she was a powerhouse, and I was thrilled to be inducted with her. And more importantly, or as importantly, I was thrilled to be inducted with an activist and a truth teller as Kica. And I am so thrilled to be on this conversation and in this conversation with you this evening.
Well, you're up, Kica.
Thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to my sister, Teresa, who is a sister in the struggle and one of my sheroes. In Connecticut, I heard so much about Teresa before I got to meet her. She's one of those people that everybody kept saying, you have to know her. She's a badass. And so it was a point of pride and honor for me to be inducted alongside her. And it was a real pleasure to learn more about Jerry Marie, and I'm really sorry that I never got to meet her. The issues that I work on at the Vera Institute are really related to justice and access to justice for some of our most disenfranchised populations in the United States, including people who are caught up in the web of the criminal legal system. We fight to end mass incarceration, to tackle racial injustices, and we also advocate for immigration reform. In New Haven, I continue to do a lot of advocacy because this is my home, and a lot of the social justice work that I do here is also related to immigrant rights and racial justice.
Thank you.
I would just say the one thing that's a reality that both Kica and I know, and you know, Geena also, is that we don't get to just live in any one identity of the issues that we're working with. These are also intersected and interconnected and intersectional. You know, you do not just get to be any one identity. We sit at the crossroads of all of those identities. And it is why I think both Kica and I do so much of the work. It's because we are, as women of color, sitting at this intersection and recognize that we cannot cut off our arm in order to have our heart beat. Our heart beats when all of us are active and in this movement together.
So well said. Thank you, Teresa. So speaking of all the movements and their intersectionality, there are differing opinions about the type of tactics that should be embraced to advance change and those that are counterproductive. For example, Kica mentioned that recently in the news, there was a controversy involving immigrant rights activists following Senator Sinema into a bathroom to talk to her about their issues and filming the encounter. Are there approaches to social justice issues that you see as productive and those that are not? Either one of you to take that.
Kica, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Kica, because I think I might have a different answer, but maybe not.
Look, what I think is most important in social justice struggle is to make sure that those who are most directly impacted by these social injustices are the ones who are leading the way at the table, demanding their rights. To me, that is critical. That is why we have succeeded on so many social justice fronts when movements are involved, right? I think about the suffragette movement. I think about the LGBTQ movement, the marriage equality movement. I think about the civil rights movement. What do those things have in common? The people most impacted were the ones leading the struggle. Where I think there are tactics that are sometimes questionable, and I don't always call it right, but I do think some tactics come from a place of desperation, come from a place of need where activists are so desperate. And I think the Senator Sinema example is one where they felt that they've worked hard to have her elected. She turned her back on them. And so there was this sense of desperation that whatever it takes to be in front of her is what we're going to do. For me, what is problematic in any movement when elites take up too much space, right? When people who have money and power elbow their way and suck up all the oxygen in the room and start articulating what they believe are the right set of outcomes.
Interesting. Teresa?
Yeah, I have to agree 100%. When we talk about impact and productivity, we have to understand that we are trying to change the systems that were not designed for us or by us. And we have to take action because this is our lived experiences every day. We have ensured in this country, so many of us, that leadership has got elected with the promise that they will fulfill those promises. And when they are not willing to be uncomfortable in order to fulfill those promises, it's unacceptable. And so I am not about critiquing my sisters, brothers, and siblings in this movement who are taking action, because we have to be and make others uncomfortable. Whether it is going to the bathroom and following somebody into the bathroom, whether it is standing outside of their homes, whether it is approaching them in the grocery store, it is irrelevant, because social injustice doesn't stop at my front door, doesn't stop in the grocery store, and doesn't stop when I go into the restroom. And restrooms that are identified by gender-specific identities is also an injustice to the conversation. And so for me, what I say is, by any means necessary, to get the justice. We have fought for 100 years. Women have fought for over 100 years to ensure that we have equity and equality, and we have neither of those things right now. And so, you know, I say to my siblings who are on the front lines, who are putting themselves at risk, do what you must, and we've got your back.
Well, thank you. So well said. And you know, adding to that, then would you say, has government reinforced the inequality, or are there any circumstances that you think they've eliminated it?
Well, I have to laugh at that question, because we are sitting here on the precipice of an election or a vote on a bill that will significantly change the lives of many people in this country in what it is attempting to do. And I think government has a role to play. Government has to be willing to share power, and we have to actually change our political structure in order to ensure that that happens. Kica has continuously, and I won't speak for you, Kica, but the reality is there are folks who are putting their bodies on the lines on a daily basis to ensure that we have systems and structures that are actually working for us. And whenever the elites determine that they are going to speak on or for or on the behalf of those that are most directly impacted, it is an ineffective way to recognize a shared power and a shared leadership.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about the elite, though. We elect politicians to speak for us. And
it's the only system we have. It's the only system we have.
I know. So even if they're elite, we're going to have to listen to their voice, right?
No, let me just say to Teresa's point, I am a great believer in democratic systems, but I think our democratic system is deeply flawed. And when we talk about politicians, right, you just said, well, our politicians are largely elite. Why? Right, that's one of the flaws in our democratic system. In order for you to be elected, you have to have a lot of money.
I know.
Right? You have to have a lot of money. You have to have a lot of power. You have to have access to power and access to influence. The people who end up being elected are not those who we would certainly identify as the most talented and most dedicated public servants with the best ideas. They are the people who have the ability to wield their power and their influence to get the right amount of resources in order to be elected. And I think that's a real problem.
It certainly is. So in light of that, when you look to government solutions, are you inspired or disillusioned?
Teresa?
I actually am inspired in some ways. I think there are folks who are standing on the front lines that are willing to shake up a system, to hold a system accountable for what we need to have. And I do believe in a democratic process. I do believe that equity and inclusion gets us to valuing the worth of every person. And we have to figure out how to engage people in a way that allows that to happen. I think I'm a true believer that 90% of those who become involved in a political system are doing it because they want to make a difference in the world, not for the power that comes with it. And so what we have to do is really recognize that as opposed to marginalizing people. Let's assume good intentions and then understand that lived experiences will get us different perspectives on things.
Kica?
Yeah, what I would say is it really depends on what government we're talking about. Right? When I think about 2016 to 2020, that to me is an example of government at its worst. And I do find some irony in the fact that the former president was somebody who was contemptuous of government. Right? We have a party that is contemptuous of government and big advocates for slashing government resources and power and limiting the ability of government to really do right in our democracy. Mm-hmm. And so I think, okay, well, we have recent examples of government at its best and government at its worst. What am I inspired by? I'm inspired by particularly local government, courageous public officials, during 2016 to 2020 who stood up, right? And they were the bulwark against anti-democratic efforts by the former administration. Under the current administration, I'm inspired by the way that this administration now has really tried to use their influence and their power to fight COVID-19, right? The Recovery Act was a good example. Efforts now around infrastructure and expanding the social safety net. Those are things that inspire me, but I'm also frustrated by, again, these systemic flaws that have led to the kind of gridlock that we're seeing in DC, and that quite frankly frustrates everybody. That's not why we paid them to go to Washington, DC. We paid them to represent us and to move an agenda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So can we find commonality in this fight in a divided nation like ours? And do we have to?
Kica,
All
I'm going to
right,
pass
here's
it to
what-
you first.
Okay, I will put on my organizer hat to say, you know, what I find rewarding about organizing is that when you do organize, when you knock on doors, when you talk to people, you often find common ground, right? And so what I would say in my organizing efforts, what do I observe? I observe that there's a small minority of people who are so set in their ways, right, that no amount of conversation and dialogue will move them, right? But there is a significant number of Americans who can be moved. We just don't engage them enough. We don't have the kind of commitment to engage in continuing conversations. The elections are very transactional, right? People knock on doors to get voted on, right? And then once they win, they're like, thank you, bye. I'm not going to knock on your door for another 4 years, right? And that is part of what I think feeds into the powerlessness and the hopelessness of folks, particularly those most disenfranchised, who feel like their views no longer matter, right? And they feel like they don't have a stake in the democratic process because nobody cares about them. They still have the power of the vote. So I am one of these people, and I know I sound like Pollyanna, but I do believe that the power of organizing constantly shows us examples of how you can actually move people if you're committed to the hard work of rolling up your sleeves and having conversations, regular conversations.
Yeah, so I would just, I'm the eternal optimist. So I do recognize that there are systems that we can put in place that could change things. So if we could institute realistically campaign finance reform and recognize that if candidates didn't have to run for election and raise money, they could actually enter into authentic relationships, not transactional relationships. And so then that gets to exactly what Kica was saying, which is like, how do we do that? What does that look like? What do we need to do? And so I'm a believer we can get there. The question is, are we willing to do what it takes to get there? And I do believe in a democratic process. I do believe that people's voice mattered. I do believe that if we changed, when our public hearings were to the hours that people actually could get there, we would hear their voices. I do believe that if elected officials did not have to worry about raising money for their next election, because that's happening every 2 years or 4 years, they would have the opportunity to sit down with people and not just listen to one person, which is oftentimes what happens in the local positioning. I know this one constituent. We could actually look at an aggregate of experiences and value those lived experiences. So, I mean, I definitely am along that lines of what Kica said. As an organizer, and I've organized in different spaces, I do believe that if we could figure out how to deepen relationship, not make it transactional, which is what's happened, change a system that doesn't rely on how long you are in office, but what you bring to the office, we could end up in a whole different conversation. Change systems that allow for campaign finance reform, which says a couple of things. One, you get paid for your time and value. You do not have to have somebody in your life who allows you to do that. You get to knock on doors to talk about real issues, and you don't have to listen to the person that pays you the most money. Then I think we end up in a very different conversation, and then everybody in our community becomes a valuable asset to the conversations of making real change.
Well, I'm inspired by both of your optimism, and I share your belief in democracy. And I couldn't help but think when you're talking too, that if, along with campaign finance reform, could we also please have a day off to vote so that everyone can go and it becomes like it is in the rest of the world, that it isn't difficult for you to do. It's actually a pleasure and you welcome that day and it's available to you. Mm-hmm. That would make a lot more voices heard now, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
So we talk a lot about benefits and burdens in society that are meant to be distributed in accordance with the principles of justice, which, as I understand it, are meant to be these 5 things: access to resources, equity, participation, diversity, and human rights. I know this is a big question, but have we lost those principles? And is it also true that we never really had them for everyone?
Wow. I don't know that we ever really had them for everyone, but I also don't know that everybody knows what those principles are. We make a lot of assumptions as a society that when we say a word, everybody understands what that word is, and that's not true. We need to give grace and space so that we can actually explain what we are talking about, and so that people can actually find their alignment for what that needs to look like.
Yeah, despite saying that I'm the eternal optimist, I don't think we've ever really had them. When I look at the history of social justice struggles in this country, to me, those are examples, right? Historical and now they're living examples of just how far we have to go, and the fact that people are constantly fighting for what should be very basic things, right? On a from the social rights perspective, a roof over your head, right? Having access to quality education, quality healthcare, healthy nutritional meals on the Democratic front, right? Having access to, being able to be an active citizen. This nation has not delivered that across the board. And what matters? It matters the color of your skin, your gender, whether you were born into wealth or into poverty. So I guess it depends on who you ask. But my own perspective is that we've never had it.
I understand, and you're not alone in that thought. You've both just touched upon education, and with educational inequality widening, do you think institutions are prepared or not prepared to address social justice issues? And to Teresa's point earlier, our institutions are as elite in certain cases as those voices that speak for us. So where are we there?
Well, I think something we have to get our hands around is prepared or not prepared is not the question. Are we all willing to come into the game and be part of it? Because I think sometimes we go, oh, that person, they're going to handle it. And then we wash our hands of what it takes to be supportive, what it takes to come to a reality and a truth for who we are and what we're trying to do and how uncomfortable we're trying to be. And so when we talk about institutional change, whether it is in a school system, in a political system, or in the workplace, even, I say, how much are we willing to put on the table? And you do not get to walk away. This happens in the women's rights movement space all of the time, which is, people go, well, I have done my time. I will leave it to the next generation. Guess what? We need us all in this together, as uncomfortable as it may be. Recognizing what it looked like in the past and where we might go to in the future. I really, push back on this any one system. Is that we don't have systems that are working for us. And we have to acknowledge that. And then we have to be willing to test the water, but test the water and fail as much as we are willing to test the water and succeed.
The only thing I would add, it is no mistake that we are seeing in particularly the most conservative states, and I want to point out to Texas, all of these efforts now to stack boards of education with deep conservatives, to really shape the curriculum in the public education system to make sure that people don't have access to education related to civil rights, to social justice. This whole flare up around critical race theory is the most recent examples. These things are not accidental. I do think that there is this constant effort on the part of extremists to try to control what information and access to education people actually have, right? Because it is much easier, right, to be able to manipulate and to brainwash and to steer people to think only about a certain way if you limit the access to the education that they have and you don't encourage analysis and free thinking. So when you talk about education, I think, oh my God, this is happening everywhere. And then I'm embarrassed, right? I can point to Texas and say, oh, everybody should mess with Texas. And that's to be expected. In these southern states, we still have some of that, but this is happening here in Connecticut.
Yes.
And it's happening everywhere. And so it calls on us to really begin to, irrespective of where you are, you can't say, well, I don't know about education, or my thing is immigrant rights, or my thing is gender justice. No, it is our obligation as citizens to begin to step up, if we're not already in that fight, to fight back against that, because that is what facilitates authoritarian regimes, and that is what is disruptive to democracies.
And on that note, the type of change that we're talking about perhaps begins at home, where that's a place to demonstrate empathy and address social justice issues. I wish we could talk about everything around all of these issues tonight, but do either one of you have any advice you would offer our listeners about, if our education institutions aren't doing it and our representatives aren't doing it, we've got to start right here at home. So how would you suggest we do that? What kinds of conversations are the way forward?
Kica, you're organizing more locally. I'd love for you to take a stab first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, not at all. Look, it's easy to have access to information depending on what you're interested in, right? Facebook is an easy way. If you're more interested in signing on to petitions, right? MoveOn.org is a good place to go. Look, there are organizations, the ACLU. I think about the Center for American Progress. If you're more think tanky, United We Dream is a grassroots organization in Connecticut. Unidad Latina en Acción. All you have to do is access Google, enter where you live and your issues, and inevitably a bunch of organizations will pop up, and then you follow the thread. You can click on their link, you can find them on Facebook, you can find them on Twitter. There's always a bunch of events happening in your community. We cannot say in this day and age that we don't have access to information that will tell us about things that are happening, where we can step up and engage in advocacy. So what I would say to folks is think about what you're interested in and find your friend Google, and you'll have access to whatever information you need to be engaged.
Yeah, I ditto. And you do not have to be the expert in this. The reality is you do not, as a parent, as a member of a community, as an auntie, you do not have to be the expert. You just have to be willing to go on the learning journey. And where that starts is, what does critical thinking look like? Is this really working? Not just for you, but for the person next door or the person down the street. Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves. And then what might we do? Let's get to dream outside of the boxes that we're currently in to get to where we want to go. And, so when I talk to young people or to people who are working with children, I say, just ask the question, what is the world you want to create? And then how do you get there? Doesn't have to be, you don't have to have the answers. You just have to have the ability to ask the question. And then, as Kica said, there are lots of organizations that are spending their time, money, and energy to try and figure out what this looks like. Can you align? What are you doing? How are you following them? Find trusted sources to be able to really look at these things. I mean, you've got Vera Institute, you've got the Ms. Foundation, both organizations that have been around for a long time, who are trusted, who have done the research, who are listening to those most impacted to determine what our next steps are. We're not saying we are perfect. We are saying we are coming with a position that is looking towards equity, equality, and inclusion.
Thank you. And, when I was preparing for this interview, I couldn't help but realize that so many prominent social justice movements like Black Lives Matter, Fourth Stage Feminism, and the Extinction Rebellion, which is the newest movement in climate injustice, were all founded by women. They say the future is female. Do you think we're the answer?
Oh, hell yes.
Yeah.
Why are we asking that question? Of course. Yes.
Needless to say, I am wearing my Feminism Is t-shirt, and it says, my feminism is political, intersectional, courageous, and powerful. And, and the reality is, yes, and we have to stop thinking this is new, that the future is feminist. The past has been feminist. Now what we are demanding is that we be seen for the transparency, inclusiveness, collaborative efforts that we are looking forward to move into, with the critique and an analysis of what white supremacy and a patriarchal culture looks like. There is a reality of this moment in time that we actually need to embrace. There are names in history that we do not know because nobody placed value in them. And, and we have been sitting at these intersections, whether it's race and gender, disability, whether it is age, whether it is, there are so many intersections. We've been sitting there, and not only is the future, but the past. There has been very few social justice movements in this country that have not been led by women or femme, whether they are in the front of the conversation or running things in the back room. And sometimes we run things in the back room, and that is more powerful than being in the front.
Hear, hear. Kica.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say is, I mentioned it at the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. When I spoke, I talked about Ella Baker, right? And I spent a lot of time looking at the role of women in the civil rights movement. And what was stunning is there were many Ella Bakers in the civil rights movement. Yes. And by that, I mean women who were organizing. They were the backbone. They were the ones who were strategizing, mobilizing, putting in a lot of sweat equity, but because they were operating in a very patriarchal system, they never got credit, they never got attention, they never got elevated. And some of them, like Ella Baker, didn't want that attention. They're like, I am doing the important work, leave me alone, I'm gonna continue to fight. But I do think far too many movements historically have both relied on women to be the ones doing all of the hard work and also deliberately excluded women's voices. And what I find heartening now is that women are able to exercise leadership and exercise leadership in ways that is just much more inclusive, right? And that does, and I love when I see women doing things differently, right? So it's not about just advancing justice. It's about advancing justice in a way that we believe is really embraces what justice really looks like in operation. So it's not, we aspire to this. It's like, we're gonna fight for justice and we're gonna do it differently.
Yeah. Thank you. We're going to be coming upon our question and answer piece shortly. So I do want to remind all our listeners, please put it in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Or you could also put it in the chat. I'll be reading both of them. But before we do that, I have one final question for each of our incredible guests today, two women who I absolutely adore. As leaders on social justice, can each one of you close with just a few words on what matters most to you in your work and what makes you the most frustrated and the most hopeful? I'll give
Teresa,
you a minute.
You want to start? That's a good one.
I knew you were gonna say that, Kica. Wow, that's such a good question. A couple of things. I would say I believe in the future. I believe in the now, and I believe in the future. Because when we just assume that a future is going to get us to where we need to go, we don't acknowledge those who are in the battle with us now. And that battle has been going on for a long time. My friend Elaine is on in this conversation, really lifting up disability rights. And there's a whole conversation that needs to happen 30 plus years after the ADA, right? 100 years after women have won the right to vote, we still do not own 50% of leadership. We have our first woman sitting as a vice president in executive leadership in the administrative branch of the federal government. You know, there is so much more to do for the now and into the future. And the thing that I am inspired by is that there are folks every day that I am meeting who are gender expansive, who are saying, I want to reimagine with you. I want to determine what that might look like. And I really look forward to what that could be. You know, I have no preconceived notions about what a safe and just world where power and possibility might look like. But I know that if we all put together some ideas, we can get to what that looks like. And what that means to me is that we all have a voice, that we all have an opportunity. I mean, at the end of the day, it is about presenting people with opportunities to live into their fullest self. And if we could just agree on what that means, housing, education, healthcare, food on our tables, access to work, opportunities to move around this country, full infrastructure systems, access to childcare. I mean, the list goes on and on. The ability to breathe the air that we want to breathe without it being polluted. I mean, there's so much that we have to do, and I believe we can get there, because if I don't, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. I believe, because I know there are folks like Kica, folks like you, and folks, so many more names that we do not say, that are doing this work because they know it is the right thing to do. I mean, today I am on my balcony outside as a staff of 20 people who are doing this work because they need to do this work for their grandmothers and their grandchildren. And that balance is so critical to this work.
What Teresa said, and here's what I would also say. I mean, I talked earlier about women doing things differently, and Teresa is a shining example of a woman doing things differently at the national stage, right? She's somebody who not only speaks truth to power, but is also always seeking ways to empower women, particularly young women of color. And that to me is inspirational, right? Teresa's not afraid to speak truth to power with so much grace and dignity, but she is also an example of how we can do things differently, right? And never lose our style or our stride. And here's what I would say, what matters to me: community and an engaged citizenry that fights for justice on all of the issues that Teresa talked about. What frustrates me? Apathy and indifference. I get really angry and upset with people who are apathetic and who really, excuse my language, don't give a shit. That drives me nuts.
Oh, here. I second that. Drives me crazy too. And to speak to your friend, Teresa, Elaine, she asked, when are we going to provide closed captioning? And 31 years after the American Disabilities Act. And I just want to say to you, Elaine, we're an office of 5 people. We do this through Zoom, and I don't know how to do that, but I'm going to find out. So thank you very much for bringing it up. And if Zoom has the capacity for us to include closed captioning on these webinars, done deal. Next time I come on, you'll see it. So thank you. We need your help in determining how we move forward as well. We've got a bunch of questions, so if you are both ready, here is one that, as she says, is a more specific question, but can Kica comment on what is currently in the Build Back Better bill on immigration reform and what is likely to stay in there and why? And what is Washington willing to do this month?
I wish that I was the bearer of good news, but quite frankly, I am very cynical about what we could expect in the legislation. We are now looking at, every week, what I'm seeing is the machete hacking away and narrowing the vision and the dream from citizenship for millions to now no path to citizenship and maybe a work permit and protection from deportation for a number of people who benefit from temporary protected status. So people from a handful of countries, agricultural workers, and dreamers. So we're looking at a small number, a few million people who've been in our country for a long time, who all they will get, if the parliamentarian in the Senate doesn't chop that off, and there's a possibility that once again, she will say that this is not appropriate legislation. If it manages to squeeze, to come out of the House and into the Senate and the parliamentarian doesn't hack that off, all we're looking about is protection for a few million people. But we're talking about second-class citizens because they will not have the right to vote and they will not get citizenship.
Sad news, indeed. And Teresa, I couldn't help but also think when we talk about them slashing at the plan, what they cut just yesterday or today with parental leave. Again, we were so hopeful when this plan came forward. There seemed to be so much opportunity for women and childcare and tax credits and parental leave and caregiver status, where we all find ourselves. Are you remaining hopeful that it won't all fall to the floor in shreds?
What I remain is, hopeful. I remain a bit frustrated and sarcastic and cynical. What Kica is talking about is a positioning of fear. The fear of granting equity and equality for everybody, giving and sharing of power. We always assume the negative, right? I am hopeful and grateful that the progressive arm of the Democratic Party stepped up and said, you have to include these things. I am disheartened by the lack of investment that we are willing to do. And so, when I look at childcare, when I look at educational equity and expansion of pre-K 2-3 in terms of age ranges, when I look at access to healthcare and what the Supreme Court is looking at, when I look at what is going on with immigration rights, I actually think that these are all real issues. Leadership is about taking a risk and about putting that on the table and not about dictating to one or two people. And we have to decide that we are going to vote people in and vote people out over time for the things that are valuable to us. And going back to what Kica said, you do not get to be apathetic. You must remain vigilant in this work. You can't just write it off. And so I look at some of the leadership and I get excited about the idea that they are willing to put themselves on the line. But if we do not give room for them to do the work in a system that is based on seniority, then we will not get to the end result. But we cannot, we are at a time that, we don't have to wait for a person on a horse to drive up and give us the information that we need to have. We have access to information 24/7, and we have to engage in that information. We need to be in contact with our elected officials, both on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level. And we have to reinforce what's going on. I mean, Representative Rosa DeLauro is the head of the Appropriations Committee. A woman from the state of Connecticut is responsible for the House Appropriations Committee. We need to ensure that she is backed and that wherever our friends and family live, that they are in conversations with their local House officials so that they can make sure that that message is getting through. It's not just about what's happening in Connecticut, it's about what's happening across the country and where are we willing to push buttons and be uncomfortable and continue a conversation.
Let our voices be heard. Here's a question for both of you. In your opinion, what two top social issues impacting BIPOC women's conversations we should aim to talk about on a weekly basis, bringing attention to women's causes in our daily lives with our friends and relatives?
So, Kica, jump in. I actually despise questions about what are the only two. What are the only ones? That is not fair to me as a woman of color, as a BIPOC woman, to say you get to choose two today. You get to choose two of your identities today that are most important or most relevant to the conversation. And so I struggle with this conversation with what are the most important, because my most important may be different than Kica's most important, may be different than my sister's most important, because we do not share identities across the table. And so the idea that we are monolithic in who we are and what we are trying to do is just not fair. Women are not monolithic in any way, shape, or form. And so what I think we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the challenge or the question that we need to be talking about today? Where do we feel comfortable? Where are we uncomfortable? What we might do, and how do we want to learn more? These are key questions that we need to be asking ourselves, because one day, one day it may be healthcare, and the next day it may be childcare or caregiving in a broader sense. The next day, it may be about pay equity. And I don't think that we can like slow the pace down. And I know that's not what people want. People are like, I don't have time for everything. You don't have time for everything. You have time for one or two things, and pick those things. And, you know, and let your lived experiences guide the conversation.
Yeah, what I would say as an organizer is it doesn't matter what I think, quite frankly, right? What I would encourage you to do is to reach out to women of color, bring them into your living room or meet at a coffee shop and ask your colleagues and your friends who are women of color, what issues do they care about? And then take it from there, right? You could be organizing an entire revolution based on what you hear from your friends and your peers who are women of color. And that also allows you to spend time learning about issues that you may not be thinking about because your interest may lie in, you know, gender justice and immigrant rights. There may be other people who care more about economic justice issues. So I would encourage you to join us, fellow organizers, and turn that question on some of your friends and start organizing.
Thank you. I want to remind our listeners, we're coming to the end of our show in just a couple of minutes. So if you have any more questions, please get them in. And I want to remind my two dear friends, Teresa and Kica, that about a year or two ago, I decided that I would no longer call myself a feminist, but be sure to call myself a climate feminist. So I've pledged to every conversation or anytime I speak publicly to mention the climate crisis. And I would be very thankful if each one of you could just give us a word on that. And as women, because again, we are taking the lead, even if we followed a 12-year-old young girl from Scandinavia into this, say something about climate change and women will change. I won't call it change, crisis. And they're all meeting over there in Europe, and 40 countries decided to pull back on coal production. And of course, the biggest countries in the world were not part of that group. So as Teresa mentioned earlier, you have these rays of hope, and then you have these big disappointments, and they keep juggling our emotions back and forth. What would you say if I gave you a minute to talk about the climate crisis?
Even though I'm not one who places hierarchies on social justice issues, I'll be blunt to say, if our planet dies, none of these issues matter, right? And as I'm a mother of a 16-year-old who cares deeply about issues related to our planet and the climate crisis, because he's afraid that he's going to die, right? And so what I would say to folks, it is time to get off your armchair if you're not active and become a part of this movement, and to elevate your voices and to put pressure on your local official, your mayor, your senator, your congressional delegation, as well as become active, and even just really take the responsibility as a citizen to figure out what are the things that I could do in the way that I live my life to be committed to trying to preserve our planet. We don't have anywhere to go to. We kill this planet. We don't get to say, okay, now we can move to Mars. We're done. There is nothing else. If this planet, if we manage to destroy this planet, we are in fact extinguishing our lives as humans.
Thank you, Kica. Teresa?
Yeah, I become overwhelmed every day by what is happening with the environmental justice and climate justice work that needs to be done. And what Kica lifted up, I think, is something we have to remember, which, yes, there are things that can be done. We have to stop being climate deniers and really recognize that each and every one of us has a role to play, not just in how often we drive and what our footprint looks like, but more broadly in a global stance. And that there are countries that will be, that have rising tides that will be gone in 10 years, so that we can, heat our homes at 72 degrees. And what are you willing to do and give up? What are the sacrifices you're willing to make? How uncomfortable are you truly willing to be in order for us to address the issues of climate justice? And what are the questions we're willing to ask ourselves? Are you planting trees? Where do you shop? What does that look like? You know, what are you willing to do? How are you willing to, what prepackaging are you doing? It does take us in this first world country to make changes, to make sacrifices, because it will be those who are providing the least amount of impact on the environment that will seek the greatest level of disaster. And I would hope we could make a global decision that we want the globe to survive. And what Kica said is true. Our young people are weighted with this idea that they will die, they will not see a world the way we've seen it, it will be flooded, it will be dried out. And we are seeing that these days. You do not have to go to Africa to find a lack of water. In this country, there are over 32 different communities, and that's on the minimum side, that do not have clean drinking water. We saw in California, community after community where wells dried up. We see in Colorado, community after community where things are happening. What are our diets? What are we willing to do in order to ensure a more balanced society and an equitable world? An equitable world. And that includes climate justice.
Thank you so much. And on that note, don't eat almonds, pomegranate, and if you want to do something really small, just cut down your meat consumption. It can be that easy. We have a couple of more questions that have come in during our talk. Angela Davis asks us to think about what's the difference between non-racist versus anti-racist. What do you think is the important difference she's suggesting here?
Wow, great question.
I must say that comes from a woman I adore who also happens to be my relative.
I think Angela is often challenging us to really think about the language that we use and how we use it. And an anti-racist approach assumes that all of us have levels of racism in us that we need to really do an analysis of. And I think that's a really key and critical conversation that we need to be having. And so what I think she is really challenging us to do and continues to challenge us to do is, what is the language we are using? Why are we using it, and how might we lean towards where we need to go? I have a whole bunch of half-baked thoughts on that, so I'm not sure I can give you a comprehensive answer, but I will think about it and get back to you.
Okay, great. Kica?
Yeah, this is a debate that I'm not very familiar with. So just simply going on the terms, what I would say is when I think of when I think of non-racist, I think it's a passive state. And I am a believer that this country has created a toxic atmosphere where racism is endemic. And so to use a term like non-racist to me is this passive state of affairs, and being anti-racist is a active way of fighting against racism in this country. And so to me, when I think about what is the world I want to live in and what do I want people to be, I want people to be anti-racist. I want them to every day wake up thinking, I'm going to do everything I can to fight against the racism in this society. And I will say, I mean, I say it often, I didn't grow up in the United States. I came here when I was 21. This is the most racist country I have ever lived in. And I was so stunned by how everything in the United States is seen through the prism of race. But if this is the only experience that you know, right? You don't, you have a tendency to accept the status quo and only react to things that are so obvious, right? Where you're an anti-racist, you're going to learn about racism. You're going to learn about the things that you can do to both identify racism and fight against racism. So I don't know what she's referring to, but simply by virtue of the words, I would encourage all of us to be anti-racist, which means actively engaging in every effort you can to fight against racism every day of your lives.
Yes.
Well, that is a wonderful way to end this webinar, and I thank you both for your comments. I hope you're reading everything in the chat box, because our listeners have reached out to both of you with praise, well-deserved, but also with comments about the things that you've said and how just here in this short time we've been able to make a difference. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate you joining me. I'd like to thank the William and Alice Mortensen Foundation and Avangrid Foundation in partnership with CNG, SGG, and UI for supporting this series. And I'd like to remind everyone to join me on November 11th at 12:30, that's your lunchtime, for my conversation with renowned journalist, author, and television producer, Janice Kaplan, to talk about her New York Times bestseller, The Gratitude Diaries. It's more than just a thank you. And now, if you missed our highlight film of our 2021 induction ceremony at the top of this hour, we're going to end with it right now. So please have another look at these two spectacular women. And I hope to all see you soon right here in the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame webinar series. Thank you, ladies. You're the best.
Thank you.
And now Michelle will play the film. Thank you all for being here. Throughout America's rich history of activism, women have taken to the streets. Presently, there are 9 giant social justice issues facing America: healthcare, voter rights, racial injustice, the refugee crisis, gun violence, the income gap, hunger, climate justice, and equality. The Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame is proud to honor and recognize the women at the forefront of these issues. But tonight, we ask that each one of you pledge allegiance to action.
Read more about our Spotlight recipients in the virtual program book. Thank you and have an enjoyable evening.
The truth is that justice almost always comes through fierce and sometimes lengthy battles. Battles fought by women, men, and young people, many of whom are directly impacted by injustice. They are amongst those who march, who protest, who make their voices heard, and who often put their bodies on the line.
Jerry Marie was living out intersectionality long before that word became popularized. She made me and so many of us better allies and better activists.
Social justice is about changing the totally screwed up systems that have been put in place. Let us not forget that not one system was designed for us or by us. And because of that, we cannot accept it. Every day, we have to do just one thing.
So I ask you, get to the streets, stand up,
Join the rebellion and do not quit until social justice is ours.
This year will be 100 years of women gaining the right to vote, which was a huge accomplishment. But there's a lot of unconscious bias that exists today still. The question we really want to answer is what we can do to create an equal environment and equal opportunities for women looking to accelerate and advance their careers as men have done. At Stanley Black & Decker, we've signed on to gender parity by the year 2030. We're putting together a lot of programs and initiatives to create an environment that women need to really be successful. We support Green Light for Girls and STEAM education programs in the communities where our employees live and work. We're working with incredible women outside of the company as well and breaking down barriers around the world. Gender equality is where my daughter can grow up and not even think about gender equality being an issue.
Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Kica. Again, I hope to see you soon before the end of the year. Let's spread some holiday cheer together. Thanks to all our guests this evening. And please, if you have a moment, take our little 3-question poll. It really helps us to collect some data on this series so that we can keep on going. Have a great evening, and until we meet again.